For more on this, we're joined now by Michael Bociurkiw. He's a global affairs analyst and a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. He joins us today from Odesa, Ukraine. Michael, as always, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Good to be with you, Hillary.
Let's start there with what I was just mentioning about these cluster munitions, the news about them, that we might be even hearing more from the Biden administration perhaps later on today. What do you make of this move and its timing?
Sure. Well, on the one hand, it will give the Ukrainians a military advantage. They can certainly strike more targets with these cluster munitions. But on the other hand, having been a former spokesperson for UNICEF, I can't say I'm too thrilled about it, because what happens, these bombs drop little bomblets. Some of them are mistaken as toys, picked up by children with devastating consequences. So there's got to be other ways to push back the Russians. This one shouldn't be at the top of the list.
Shouldn't be at the top of the list, but it would seem that perhaps that's what we're going to hear from the U.S. later today. Of course, as you're saying, possibly some devastating humanitarian impacts from those munitions. What impact could they have? What impact do you think that the Biden administration, for example, thinks they might have on the counteroffensive?
Yeah, well, President Zelensky has been very active in the media the past few days, saying that he wishes, as do many Ukrainians, that this type of lethal weaponry had come much, much earlier, because then the counteroffensive, I think, would have started earlier, would have been more robust. The problem, Hillary, we're facing right now is that the Russians have had time to fortify their positions, dig trenches, and crucially lay a lot of landmines that has slowed down the Ukrainian offensive. Western leaders, and including Mr. Trudeau, should look at themselves in the mirror and ask themselves why they didn't grow the spine earlier to stand up to Mr. Putin, help Mr. Zelensky, and really provide them with lethal weaponry from day one.
Is there a different type of weaponry, a different type of aid that you think might be perhaps more effective and perhaps better on the humanitarian front than these cluster munitions?
Sure, absolutely. Well, what the Ukrainians are asking for on a speeded up process are those F-16 jets. And the reason why is because they need what's called the total envelope to do the offensive. The battlefield tanks, the armored vehicles, and also the air cover. And, it's sad because the lack of air cover has resulted in cities, for example, in Western Ukraine, Lviv, being targeted just the other day, 10 people dead now, dozens injured. And this should really resonate across Canada, because a lot of Ukrainian diaspora in Canada trace their roots back to the city of Lviv. Many of them have relatives, including mine, who were born and grew up there. And also, the Ukrainian Catholic University is there. It was damaged, and it's heavily supported by donors in the U.S. and Canada.
Michael, of course, for months now, we've been talking about the lead up to this counteroffensive. We've been hearing about it from Ukrainian officials. We've been hearing about it from NATO members as well, the lead up here. Why do you think that Ukraine launched it now, if it seems like they maybe didn't have the supplies that they either needed or wanted?
Well, time is not on the side of Ukraine in a sense, because the economy is really suffering. A lot of people, millions have left, a lot of Ukrainians' best talent. And I was just talking to a group of people from Odesa, business owners, yesterday, and they said, we can last another year, but we can't go any longer with this blow to the economy, the lack of tourists. So I think Ukraine, on that hand, is forced to launch the counteroffensive. But also, there is pressure from the West that has donated all of these billions of dollars worth of weaponry to go ahead and use it. So the Zelensky government is in a tough position, but, I really have to emphasize the point, Hillary, that unlike the Russians, who are prepared to, dispose of wave upon wave of recruits, of army personnel, of convicts sent to battle, the Ukrainians have a strong sense of humanity, and when they feel threatened, they pull their men and women back. So big difference there.
Where does that leave us then, Michael? Hearing you say that some people you've been speaking with think that this can, they have what they need to perhaps carry on for another year. Of course, we know that this might go on longer, that Vladimir Putin might continue to launch wave after wave. Where does this leave the Ukrainians then at this point?
Yeah, well, I think the understanding in Kyiv is that the only way the Russians will come to the negotiating table if they feel threatened. So in order to do that, I think they have to really focus their efforts on the south. cut off that land bridge linking the Russian mainland with Crimea, and also kind of move closer to Crimea and use those long-range weapons to strike Russian supply depots, bridges, that sort of thing, then I think the Russians will be prepared to sit down. In fact, we're also getting news that there have been back-channel diplomacy going on in Washington between former U.S. officials and the Russian side on what a peace agreement would mean to Russia. But again, the only way the West, and I think Ukraine, and most importantly, is going to get what they want is to put Russia in the corner, threaten them.
Michael, just before we let you go here, I have to imagine that so much of what you were just talking about is going to be coming up next week, because that NATO summit, of course, coming up in Lithuania. One of the topics, Ukraine's interest in joining that military alliance and joining NATO. They want some sort of firm commitment here that they can possibly join once the war is over. Talk a little bit about what you're going to be looking for next week. Do you anticipate that the Ukrainians might get what they want from the summit?
Yeah, all the signals are that it will take quite some time for Ukraine to join NATO, to be admitted, rather. There's fears in European capitals of taking NATO right up to Russia's border, even further. For the Ukrainian side, look, they already feel as if they're de facto members of NATO. They've used that language before. There's more integration, interoperability, a lot of NATO training going on here, as well as outside Ukrainian borders. So in a way, it will be a symbolic admission. I think, though, if you talk to the average Ukrainian, they'd get more excited about being a member of the EU ahead of NATO, and European politicians have a lot more work to do to make that process speeded up as well.
Are you anticipating any breakthroughs? Thinking here, for example, about Sweden and its efforts to join NATO. Do you think anything concrete, any breakthroughs might come from the summit next week?
Well, the big wrench there to overcome is Mr. Erdogan in Turkey. He's just emerged as a stronger man even further after his elections. The Turks are not particularly thrilled with Sweden right now over recent events, so they have the veto power and they'll probably use it for now. But NATO is going to be sending a lot of symbolic statements Ukraine's way, how they're going to support it for the long term. But it would be good if they could at least give a clear roadmap, an expedited roadmap of how Ukraine could enter the alliance.
Michael, as always, thank you for this. We do appreciate your time and your insights today.
My pleasure.